Hi, I'm Walter Hang. I'm with Toxics Targeting in Ithaca, New York. I've been very involved with Marcellus Shale horizontal hydrofracking activities in the last year and a half. Recently, many people have contacted me about Executive Order 41, which David Paterson signed just before leaving office. There's a lot of confusion about what the executive order requires. Is it good? Is it bad? What's going on? And that's why I'm reaching out today to let you know that, number one, this is a stupendous victory. Many of you joined more than 10,000 elected officials, business owners, environmental groups, individuals calling for the draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement, which was released at the end of September 2009, to be withdrawn, sent back to the drawing board, and fundamentally revised because of its many shortcomings. The executive order essentially accomplishes this. It requires that draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement to be comprehensively revised to address all of the environmental impacts associated with horizontal hydrofracking, and also requires the Department of Environmental Conservation to outline how those impacts can be mitigated. So potentially this is a very, very important achievement. Unfortunately, it could be very short-lived. So I want to basically give you a little bit of background on where things stand and what might be looming for the future. The bottom line is that when Marcellus Shale horizontal hydrofracking was being proposed in 2008 in New York State, DEC Commissioner Pete Granis and Governor Paterson, to their credit, said, we're not allowing any horizontal hydrofracking in Marcellus Shale in New York until we adopt a supplemental generic environmental impact statement to safeguard the environment and public health. Now, this was based on their assertion that the 1992 generic environmental impact statement had adequately protected New York's environment from drilling hazards associated with vertical wells. A vertical well is you drill down, you hit a pocket of gas, you extract the gas for maybe 3 to 5 years, and then there's no more gas in the ground and the well gets plugged. Horizontal hydrofracking in Marcellus Shale is very different. Number one, Marcellus Shale is about a mile deep on average in most of the areas of the formation. So you have to drill all the way down to the shale, and the shale layer is very, very thin. So you have to drill then through that thin layer of shale, and the gas is present in microscopic pores. So instead of just hitting a pressurized pocket and the gas just comes up the well, you have to hydraulically fracture the rock. That means you pump fracking fluid into the rock under tremendous pressure, and this cracks the rock. The fracking fluid has chemicals that make the water slippery. That's why they call it slick water hydrofracking, and it also has sand. The sand keeps the cracks from closing up, and then the gas can be extracted maybe for 30 years. So the state of New York said, we're not going to allow this practice until we adopt new regulations. Now, Toxics Targeting came along at the very end of that regulatory process, and we challenged the key assertion that the existing regs were fine. We looked at hundreds of thousands of reported spills that had been essentially compiled by the Department of Environmental Conservation, and we found literally hundreds of fires, explosions, polluted water supply wells, homes that had to be evacuated, and most importantly, massive natural gas drilling wastewater spills that had never been cleaned up for decades. So the bottom line is that the New York State regulations adopted in 1992 are woefully inadequate, and that's why we wrote to Governor Paterson and said, withdraw the draft, expand the scope, and basically send the entire process back to the drawing board. The supplemental only dealt with 3 key issues. Number one, the effects of extended period of time at the drill pad. Instead of drilling 1 well per pad, with Marcellus Shale horizontal hydrofracking in New York, there could be up to 16 wells per pad. Number 2, the effects of increased water drawdown. With hydraulic fracturing, you need maybe 5 to 7 million gallons of water per Marcellus well. That's a tremendous amount of water. It could literally drain creeks dry. It could lower groundwater. It's potentially a huge problem. Number 3, perhaps the most important issue is that the city of New York gets water for 8 million people from its west of Hudson reservoir system, and that overlays Marcellus Shale. So the state said, we have to make sure that if Marcellus Shale horizontal hydrofracking is allowed, that the New York City watershed is adequately safeguarded. Unfortunately, this supplemental scope excluded all kinds of very important issues. Notably, what do you do with the natural gas drilling wastewater that's generated by hydraulic horizontal fracking? And that is a tremendous problem because it's very, very high in dissolved solids. In effect, it's salty. Number 2, it's toxic contaminated. Number 3, it's actually radioactive. So as you know, toxics targeting work with groups, individuals, elected officials, more than a year. And at the end of December, we had pressured Governor Paterson, DEC Commissioner Granis before he was fired, and the Environmental Protection Agency to essentially address these fundamental shortcomings of the draft SGEIS. And so at the end of December, Governor Paterson vetoed the little mini moratorium that would have held off on hydrofracking permits until only May 15th. He said that in effect this was a symbolic victory. It really didn't in any way protect New York, and it could have an economic impact on the drillers associated with vertical wells. But then he adopted this executive order, and when I read it, I was just totally blown away because it said, in effect, the draft SGEIS is inadequate. It's received a lot of criticism. That was acknowledged by acting DEC Commissioner Peter Awanowitz, and it said, in effect, DEC has to fundamentally revise it comprehensively, and then the executive order called upon the DEC to put out a revised draft on or about June 1st, 2011, and confirmed that no horizontal hydrofracking permits could be issued until a final was adopted, if ever. So, in theory, this executive order could require a reset of the regulatory process. Unfortunately, Joe Martens, the DEC Commissioner nominee for Andrew Cuomo, testified on February 8th in a legislative budget hearing that he, in effect, simply wants to continue to review the comments that have been received by DEC regarding the original draft and then come out with another draft by the June 1st deadline. He does not evidently want to expand the scope of the regulatory proceeding, and that is absolutely key. And that's how come I wrote another coalition letter to Governor Cuomo, and I basically said, number 1, set up a citizens advisory committee and a technical advisory committee to tell DEC how to revise the draft, to identify all the issues that had been excluded from the original scope. In addition, I suggested that the governor allow a 30-day comment period. So again, all of the issues that have cropped up in the last 2.5 years that were not part of the original scope for the SGEIS could be presented to the DEC. And then I also requested that some very, very stringent GA effluent limitations be applied to the natural gas drilling wastewater. GA refers to groundwater that provides drinking water. So these effluent limitations are very, very tough, and they would prevent hydrofracking problems, deep well injection problems. If this wastewater is sent to publicly owned treatment plants, it would make sure that you don't have what are called pass-through problems. And unfortunately, there's been no decision on whether or not these GA effluent limitations would be applied or not. And I've also requested that individual EISs be used for fracking permits. And this is, again, a very, very important regulatory requirement. So we have some procedural requirements, we have some substantive requirements, and that's how come I urge everyone who signed my original coalition letter calling for the draft SGEIS to be pulled off the table, sent back for fundamental review, to now sign this new coalition letter to Andrew Cuomo. The bottom line is that so long as a final supplemental generic environmental impact statement is not adopted in New York, there is a de facto moratorium on horizontal hydrofracking in Marcellus Shale. So we want all of these critical issues addressed and resolved before that de facto moratorium is lifted. Now, the 1992 generic environmental impact statement took 12 years to adopt. So if we are successful at expanding the scope of the supplemental GEIS, we might be able to delay horizontal hydrofracking in New York's Marcellus Shale for a long, long time. If we are not successful at expanding the scope of the proceeding, it could be out the door before we know it. So I know that many people believe that academic studies are going to save the day. That's not likely. Marcellus Shale represents a potential $2 trillion payday for many of the biggest corporations on the planet. If you think they're just going to leave that money and go away, it's probably not going to happen. They're going to fight with all their might. If you think that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's National Hydrofracking Study is going to save the day, that's probably not going to happen either. EPA has essentially no regulatory authority when it comes to permitting horizontal hydrofracking in New York. The Department of Environmental Conservation issues the permits. If you think that you can pass a local ban in your community or your county, that's essentially not going to happen either. There's no home rule in New York State, so those little bans are not likely to survive legal challenge. If you think that there is going to be a statewide hydrofracking ban in New York State, unfortunately that's not going to happen either. The state Senate was returned to Republican control, and so the likelihood of any meaningful Marcellus Shale legislation being adopted this session is very, very low. The bottom line is that this is an executive branch decision. The governor is going to make the call. The Department of Environmental Conservation is going to make the call. And that's how come I implore you, sign the coalition letter calling for these fundamental reforms to be adopted without further delay. We have to get all those other issues that were excluded 2.5 years ago included in the scope of the supplemental generic environmental impact statement. If we're able to do that, this proceeding could take a long time, and until that final SGEIS is adopted, there's going to be no horizontal hydrofracking allowed in Marcellus Shale. Now, the firms could pursue individual environmental impact statements until a final SGEIS is adopted, but they've promised to wait until a final SGEIS is adopted and is in place. So that is our saving grace. Very shortly, there's going to be new information coming out about what you can do to help make sure that New York's environment and public health are safeguarded from Marcellus Shale horizontal hydrofracking. So thank you all for all of the incredible help that you've provided. A year and a half ago, no one believed that we could hold off horizontal hydrofracking for this long. Former DEC Commissioner Pete Granis said that horizontal hydrofracking would begin in New York's Marcellus Shale by March 2010. So we are in good shape. Try to focus. Try to make sure that a final SGEIS is not adopted until all of these issues are resolved. I believe that's our best bet. Thank you so much.